reflecting on the first 100 days with Congressman Glenn Ivey of the great class of 1983, representing the 4th District of Maryland in our U.S. House of Representatives, and Massachusetts Attorney General Andrea Campbell. The moderator for this evening will be Angelina Sylvain. Angelina is a STAR 2016 PhD in neuroscience, currently serves as the Vice Dean of Graduate Education at the University of South Carolina, and in her service to Princeton, serves as the Vice President of the Association of Princeton Graduate Alumni, and is a member of the Alumni Council Executive Committee. Tonight's format, we'll start the conversation with prepared questions. It'll be about 30 minutes, 30 to 35 minutes of prepared questions, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. And with that, I will turn it over to Angelina to begin tonight's event. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony, for that kind introduction, and welcome everyone. It's an honor to be here today to guide what is sure to be a really exciting conversation with fellow Princeton alums. We have both Andrea Campbell, class of '04 here, the first Black woman elected to be Massachusetts Attorney General, as well as Congressman Glenn Ivey of class of '83 and representative of Maryland's 4th Congressional District. I'll ask that each of the panelists take about a minute to introduce themselves, and then we'll go ahead and move into the discussion. Andrea?
Thank you, and thank you all for having me. It's great to be on with the Congressman, of course, to talk about our 100 days, because I'm sure he will agree it is busy, for sure. Obviously, serving as the Attorney General in Massachusetts, I often remark I have the best job, I think, in the nation, not just in Massachusetts, given the issues we're talking about in this moment in time, and really excited to be here. I was the class of '04 at Princeton. I was not a member of an eating club. I was very much independent, lived in Spelman, started off as a math major and ended up changing my major to Judaic Studies and Sociology. That's a whole separate conversation, but really happy to be here with all of you. And thank you to everyone who organized this conversation and joining us tonight.
Well, Judaics, from math to Judaic studies. Now that's pretty interesting. I can't top that one, I don't think. So my name's Glenn Ivey. I graduated in 1983. And I've been in Congress now for a little over 100 days. I'm sure my experience is very different than the Attorney General's. We're in the minority in the House. We have Republicans. I'm on the Homeland Security Committee, for example, with Marjorie Taylor Greene. And, there are days when she's sort of the moderate voice on the Republican side of the committee. So it's been kind of a wild ride. I'm enjoying it, though. I really am. I knew that when when I knew after we'd lost the majority, what we'd be doing is essentially, in the minority, they'd be doing a lot of investigations that we'd have to push back on. But, I've had a career, 35 years or so now as a trial lawyer, appellate lawyer, litigator. I've been a prosecutor and the like. So I'm used to adversarial proceedings, basically. So, this is nothing new for me. And I think it's important stuff. It's an important moment. We can talk more about some of the details in a few, but Washington is in a weird place, and I want to see if we can navigate our way through it.
Thank you. There's all of these gems there that we can kind of pull at a little bit later in the program. I want to start with a bit of a softball, right? Each of you represent different eras of the Princeton experience. What was your experience like as an undergraduate at the institution? And in what ways did that impact where you find yourself today?
I had a great experience when I was at Princeton, but it was also a bit different, and I'll give more details. So when I got to Princeton, I was coming, frankly, from a family background that was quite tragic, having lost my mom, who actually died in a car accident, going to visit my father, who was incarcerated for the first 8 years of my life. And then my father got out of prison when I was 8 and did the best he could, frankly, in stressing the importance of education. So when I got to Princeton, frankly, it was a big deal, as you can imagine, for the family. I was the first in my family to go to college. But at that time, both my brothers were cycling in and out of the prison system and incarcerated. Fast forward, when I was a sophomore at Princeton, my father actually passed. I talked to one morning and he died the same evening when I was 19 and obviously at Princeton. And so I quickly felt like I had to grow up quickly. I already had jobs to maintain, tuition and everything else, but post the passing of my dad, really had to work a lot more. I was commuting back and forth between Princeton and Boston to maintain an apartment. And so quickly my perspective shifted a little bit. But what I will say is Princeton was supportive every step of the way. When I first started, in terms of resources after the passing of my father, they really stepped up. I graduated on time. And I think that's frankly is because of the institutional support, also the support of classmates and professors. And so I overall had a great experience at Princeton. If there are any regrets, it's maybe that I wish I enjoyed it a little bit more, connected a little bit more to the folks who were there while I was there. But other than that, I really enjoyed it. And it's unique, but it really speaks to Princeton's ability to try to support students through all types of tragedies and to ensure they're successful going through the institution.
Well, my experience was kind of a transition. I grew up in when we lived in Rocky Mount, it was still segregated. When we moved up to Dale City, Virginia, we moved into an almost entirely white community. So that was a pretty dramatic shift right there. But when I got to Princeton, I quickly realized that whether it was Rocky Mount or Dale City, I mean, everybody that I'd known and grown up with was, basically kind of working folks. Dale City's right between Fort Belvoir and Quantico. So there were a lot of military people there, school teachers, cops, that kind of thing. I got to Princeton and like the first day the parents drop you off and there was a car out in front that one of my classmates drove up in, and it was a brand new BMW. I'd never seen a BMW before. This is 1979. And so I was like, wow, man, that's a great car. What is that? And he looked at me like I just stepped off a spaceship or something. And then he told me that for his graduation present, his family had sent him to Europe. So he backpacked through Europe. And while he was in Germany, the exchange rate was so good, it was cheaper to buy the BMW there and ship it back than to wait until he got back to the United States to buy it. And I was just like, what? It was kind of, it was really kind of a different scene from that perspective. But after a little while, I got to know some folks. We had really some good groups of friends that I connected with over time. So certainly by sophomore year, I was pretty comfortable and had made the adjustment. Academically, I'd gone to a public school called Garfield, which is a jock school, but I was a little behind, but it wasn't horrific. So I was able to catch up pretty much after one semester. So, it was a bit of a transition, but it was really a great experience once I got going, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. I majored in politics, to nobody's surprise, I guess, because I knew I wanted to go to law school. Well, I knew I wanted to go to law school after a few years in the NBA, but I continued to be 5'9", and so it ended up that I was able to go straight from college to law school. Go figure, right?
I think that it worked out. I think in the long run. I definitely resonate with both of your journeys of both like the protection that is the resources of Princeton, and also sort of the shock of that environment, having not come from that environment myself. I come from a suburb in California, and it's a much more diverse space there, both socioeconomically, as well as, you know, the variety of ethnic backgrounds. But I will say, like, there's a lot of power, certainly, to the resources of this university.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
You touched on something. So it sounds almost like you were aiming to go, you had plans for office, like from the get-go. Was that what your path was like? What about you, Andrea? Was it always in your plans to run for office?
No, absolutely not. And I just had someone ask me this yesterday from my office. When I started at Princeton, I wanted to go into accounting or something where you had to do applied math. I loved math, and it wasn't until actually after the passing of my dad, when I came back, that a professor there suggested I major in Judaic studies. And my immediate response was, well, what am I going to do with that? As a Christian, I was in the classes because I cared deeply about Black and Jewish relationships, particularly during the Civil Rights era in urban settings, including Boston, New York. And what she suggested was focusing on my interests. And I had, at that point, really lost interest in math as they started to move into a direction of theory and developing theory, which I was not interested in. And so I found that the sociology and Judaic studies coming together was really something I was interested in. And it just worked out that I got to major in both and focus on Black and Jewish relationships, which was really remarkable. And so kudos to professors who sort of see what you might care about and push you to go in a certain direction. But ultimately, after Princeton, I went to work at a law firm in New York as a paralegal to really think about deeply if I wanted to go to law school. Ultimately decided that I did, thinking I would go into labor and employment work. I wanted to stay away from everything criminally related. And so fast forward, got the opportunity to work as an attorney for Governor Deval Patrick, who was the first Black governor here in Massachusetts. And what's amazing, and maybe actually nationally too, not just in Massachusetts, there's a significant historical record there for him too, but got to work with him as a lawyer. And it was the first time I got to see the importance of being the elected, not just at the table, but the elected with a certain background and a certain lived experience, and how that could inform decision-making and policy. So after that, decided to run for city council at the encouragement of so many folks. And the rest is really history. I guess I got the bug and got to really think deeply about my gifts. And now I'm serving in this role that is incredible, to say the least, and applying my law degree in so many different ways to help people. So it's an interesting journey, to say the least.
What about you, Congressman? You catch the bug?
Well, in a way, I mean, because the bug kind of didn't exist when I was a kid. So, you know, you're going back to the late 60s and the 70s. There were almost no Black elected officials anywhere in the country. You had a handful of mayors start coming in the sort of mid to late 70s, you know, Marion Barry in DC, Maynard Jackson in Atlanta, Coleman Young in Detroit. But, you know, there's a real short list. And so I was interested in public service, public involvement because of the civil rights movement. I mean, it had really, you know, I grew up watching how it, you know, they're marching there, and then, you know, here where I live, you know, they desegregate the schools, or, you know, you can go eat at this restaurant now, or, you know, whatever. All these changes that you saw the cause and effect, really, from the civil rights movement, improving the lives of African-American people like my family. And so I thought that was really kind of great. And, you know, Dr. King, you know, he's a revered figure now, but he was, you know, almost a deity at the time, at least in my house. The Kennedy brothers were the same way, and especially right after the assassination. So for me, it was an interest, although I didn't, you know, the path of running for office and getting elected hadn't really dawned on me when I was at Princeton.
It's interesting. I'm sensing a theme here between both of your experiences of really having an opportunity to observe the impact that these kinds of roles and spaces can have, that led you into this industry, this like profession that you're in today. is like having the opportunity to see the change that it could have, not only on people broadly, but on people that you identify with that are a part of our communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it was that for sure. And, you know, the civil rights movement, I mean, they were all ministers and, you know, preachers. And one thing I really figured out at Princeton was that I was no preacher. So, you know, we weren't going to go down that track. So, you know, if you aren't called to the ministry, and the other one kind of opened up. I mean, Jesse Jackson ran for president in '84, and then actually Mel King in Boston. So I'd gotten up to law school. Mel King ran for mayor, and he ran a really good race. And I was like, well, man, if you can get close here, and because as I mentioned a minute ago, the racial environment in Boston in the mid '80s was just horrible. But he ran a credible race. So that's when I started actually thinking about, well, maybe I could do that as well.
I wanna lean our conversation.
I just want to add to that because Mel King, I was just attending his service, just passed, and it's as you can imagine, was a tremendous celebration here, celebration of life and accomplishment. And Boston is still yet to elect a Black mayor. So there's still some lingering effects of what the congressman was talking about. But it does make a difference when you have folks modeling, obviously, what political leadership looks like and what you can accomplish in those roles. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge Mel King. And if you don't know anything about his story, it is really significant and has had an international effect in many ways. And they just had a celebration of life recently in Boston, but it offers an inspiration to anyone who's thinking about running for office, frankly, to just go for it, and to really think about coalition building in the process.
So I want to pivot because I do want to make sure we have time to talk about what these past 100 days have been like for each of you. And Congressman, you touched on this in the beginning, that the role that you and the AG play is a little bit different. What do your roles entail for this population? If you could just give like a brief sense, and then I'd love to hear more about sort of the political agenda that's happened over the last few days.
You want me to go first, or?
Yes, please. Okay.
Well, it's interesting because my predecessor left Congress after only 6 years to run for Attorney General. So that should tell you a little something right there. So he beat me. His name's Anthony Brown. He's the AG for Maryland now. He beat me in 2016, and I thought, well, he'll stay there for the rest of his career. We're roughly the same age. He's a little younger, but not that much. So I just went back to private practice and sort of set my mind to, I'll just, you know, enjoy private practice. And my practice was it was really becoming like a growing, fun thing to do. You know, Lafayette Square protesters and stuff like that, in addition to the stuff that kept the lights on. But he decided to run for the AG. I jumped in the race and won. I'd been interested in Congress really for about 40 years. In fact, I tell people it took me 40 years to get here. I certainly didn't rush into the job. But it's been an interesting 100 days. I mean, I think, you know, just the funny beginning, funny in a way, is it taking 5 days to elect the speaker. You know, so we had a mock swearing in. I didn't want Kevin McCarthy swearing me in, so we did a private one, basically with 350 people showed up. So but just an informal one. But we wrapped it up at noon to hustle over to the Capitol, because usually swearing in the speaker getting voted is like a 2 or 3 minute deal. So we literally ran to the Capitol to get there by noon. And, you know, 5 days later, find out that, you know, he really hadn't counted the votes up front. He hadn't lined it up, and it took him 5 days in this kind of, I thought, kind of embarrassing public spectacle to get it lined up. So that's how it got started. And it's been kind of more of the same all the way through. I can elaborate more, but I'll give the general a chance to talk about her experience as well.
It is certainly busy, and it is different in many ways. I mean, where there's some similarities, of course, is the constituent services, constituents who reach out to your office for support around a whole host of things, whether it's around housing concerns, things related to their children, a lot of consumer protection issues. So in that regard, the roles are similar in many ways. And we are also advocating for legislative changes. I was at the State House most of the day today, testifying in support of various pieces of legislation, including around equal pay, and protecting tenants who are going through evictions to also have protection. So there's the legislative solutions too, which are significant and important. But it has been a busy 100 days. And I've been stressing most folks don't follow the work of an attorney general. And I think in this moment in time, it's become more relevant because of the Supreme Court decisions around the environment, of course, everything related to reproductive justice, potentially decisions around affirmative action, you name it. The states and the state AGs are really expected to stand up and to protect our residents in the face of a court that I think is going in the wrong direction. In addition to that, everything related to gun violence in this country, and I don't care where you live, it seems like we can't turn on the news without hearing about another horrific mass shooting in this country. And so there's a lot to do in that space that AGs can do. And especially if you're in a state like Massachusetts, where the breadth and scope of the power is significant in terms of what you can do to protect consumers, to fight legislatively on a whole host of issues. We also prosecute crimes regularly in the office. In addition to that, of course, just basic protection of people's rights here. And so the list is long. So it has been a busy 100 days, to say the least. But there has also been an opportunity, I'd be remiss if I didn't say this, to work with AGs across the country. And of course, the Maryland AG, we were just together at a national conference, and we sit next to each other because of our states. So we're going to be seeing a lot more of one another. But that's also been a unique part of the job too, is getting out of the state to work with AGs across the country to push for some reforms on a whole host of issues. So it's exciting, at the same time, very busy.
Has anything been, I guess said differently, what has been the most surprising thing that's happened in your respective camps? Andrea, let's start with you.
The most surprising, that is a good question. There's
a lot that's happened.
I think, say again.
There's a lot that's happened.
There is, and maybe that's what it is. It's all happening at once. Yeah. And you're testifying, you're on TV talking about something, you're responding to constituents. I'm also a wife and a mom of 2 boys. All that is important. But I think the biggest thing I'll stress is I guess the national work. Massachusetts, I already knew I worked in a great state and in an office that has an incredible reputation around the country because of some of the work the office has done in the past, particularly in the opioid crisis, and going after, say, ExxonMobil and the climate cases that we're taking on. But when I stepped out of Massachusetts to really meet with other AGs, the connection that people have to Massachusetts is significant. And it's really special to talk about whether it's the higher ed institutions that people have come here to visit or to attend, our hospital system, or they're born and raised here. So the connections with Massachusetts are really significant. And that's been surprising. So it's an opportunity to really work in partnership with a lot of people that we wouldn't initially thought would be partners in the work. And so we're constantly thinking about that, but that's been really great. And the support has come from different spaces and different connections, which is really important serving in elected office, particularly, and I'll name it as Black electeds. We're here, but it's still challenging to keep our seats, of course, and to do the work and to do it with a sense of urgency, particularly for folks who have ever felt left out or left behind.
I mean, for me, I'd worked on the Hill before. So, I worked, I got a position with Congressman John Conyers in 1987, stayed with him a couple years, left. I was a federal prosecutor in DC for 4 years. And then I came back to the Senate side. In fact, I worked under Paul Sarbanes when I got there, and then later Tom Daschle. So for me, I'd had a chance to see the House and the Senate, and I came back to do the Whitewater hearing. So the investigative stuff. I was really familiar with all of that. We had pretty rough and tumble guys at that time as well on the Republican side. Mike Chertoff was the lead counsel, for example. So, a lot of that stuff, kind of was deja vu. I will say this, though. I mean, I think the tenor of what's going on now is a lot more troublesome, in part because I think the country is more at risk than it was in the mid-90s. I thought, the Whitewater hearings were about the Republicans trying to get Clinton out of the White House through investigations because they couldn't beat him at the ballot box. I think now this stuff is a lot more insidious. The stop the steal, and a lot of these guys, I don't know which is worse, the ones that know that Trump lost the election and Carrie Lake lost her election and all this election fraud stuff is nonsense. But then there's a whole group that's also troublesome who really believe that, Biden stole the election from Trump and the January 6th guys are patriots and all of that. So the politics and the institution are pretty much the same in a way, but the people, especially on the Republican side, are way different. And I think a lot of that, you had sort of white Republicans kind of splintered, beginning with there's Pat Buchanan, but it really got expanded when Barack was elected. And then you saw the rise of the Tea Party, the angry stuff started heating up, leveraged with social media, the silos for information. They only watch Fox News, for example. Like all of that stuff has sort of culminated in Trump. And the real scary day was January 6th. I mean, I wasn't too far away from the Capitol. I was in my law office and I was looking something up and I went online and the CNN stuff popped up, like happening now or something. And I thought it was like a movie. It looked like, one of those like zombie movies where they're like, climbing the scales of the castle or something. And I did a double take and I was like, that's the Capitol. And some of the buildings and the rooms that they were going into, I'd had offices when I was working for Daschle on the leadership staff. I had an office down there. I mean, they were breaking into the places where I'd worked, and there were people who were still here that I knew. And my son and his wife live like 3-4 blocks north of the Capitol. So for me, it was just a really scary day. And I guess that's not what surprised me about being in Congress, but this environment that we're in right now is this is a real scary moment, I think, for the nation. And we need to, I think we're working our way out of it, but we're not done yet for sure.
Yeah. Would you say that some portion of interacting with, as you said, different people now is related to having different mindsets? I think you touched on this a little bit, that we're in this mode of expanded communication that's really facilitated these silos of sources of truth. We have divergent sources of truth. And we're getting to this point now where even the ability to validate what is and is not true is becoming more and more challenging. So how do members of political office navigate that? How do you affect change in that kind of an environment?
Well, I probably should field this one because I guess up there in Boston, it's pretty deep blue, so it might be a little bit of a
Somewhat.
different.
I'll talk about that in a minute. Somewhat.
Yeah, I was thinking with the AG in particular, because you do a lot of national collaborations. I
Okay.
imagine that would come into play there. But yes,
In
go
many
ahead.
ways. So the work, it's actually striking this balance of making sure we're focused on residents here and of course addressing their concerns. And I think if there's one constructive criticism that folks had of my predecessor, who's now our governor, is there was a lot of attention on national issues. What about us here in Massachusetts? You have folks here struggling with poverty. You have folks in some pockets of the state who think their votes are not being counted and that there might be some issues when it comes to people of color accessing the ballot. Concerns around violence and violence in certain communities, concerns around affordability, you name it. And so I'm striking this balance of really being present here, but also reminding folks that Massachusetts, there's an expectation that we lead on certain conversations around reproductive justice, guns, things related to healthcare, including as well as the environment, education, because of the ecosystem in which we live and work, and the laws that we have on the books here are quite progressive. And so as I'm doing the national work, it can be challenging. There are some spaces where it's just Democratic AGs that come together, but there's also an organization, and kudos to the leadership of this organization, that is holding us together, where we bring together Republican and Democratic AGs from across the country. And we do not agree on everything. We've had to set rules of engagement, things you just can't talk about when you walk into the room. But one area I'm proud that we can talk about is how we protect children and the well-being of our youth, particularly around depression, anxiety, suicide, mental health concerns, social media companies and the role they play. There's a multi-state bipartisan effort here and happening and developing with respect to Republican and Democratic AGs. So we're trying to figure out what are those opportunities to work on significant and meaningful work. And then in Massachusetts, we have pockets too that are, I want to be careful to say red or blue, because in certain pockets of the state, people said you have no business don't even go there because you're going to lose. But because I showed up in some of these red pockets and most folks just didn't, we won parts of the state we had no business, I guess, winning, because I engaged and obviously shared my story that related to other people's stories, talked about issues of concern and what we would do to help, which I think is a learning lesson. But also we have pockets of the state where we're dealing with white supremacy and groups that are pushing hate and connected to some national organizations, some active investigations into hate crimes and hate groups here in Massachusetts that are very disturbing. And so we have our share of that work too. And so I remind folks, we may be, of course, in Massachusetts where we should be progressive by every metric, but in some instances we're not. So we have work to do, and it is sad, and I agree with the congressman. People should be really concerned about the state of political affairs. And this should hopefully inspire folks to get out and vote. Everyone is there because someone voted to put them there, and to mobilize more people to engage, to vote, and maybe even to run for office, to sort of begin to unseat these folks who are just not there for the right reasons, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the rules of engagement is an interesting one. And again, back to the Obama era, I think there were hurricanes. So traditionally, as you all know, when you have a major disaster, the president might go visit it, to lend support and, show that he cares. And I remember when Obama went to New Jersey after, I think it was Hurricane Sandy, and Chris Christie was the governor at the time, came out and met him on the tarmac. And they shook hands and, went about their business of trying to get funds to the state for disaster relief. But they blew up Chris Christie on the media for that. Republicans just attacked, they savaged him. Same thing when Obama went to Florida. I think it was Charlie Crist was maybe the governor then. But it's at the point now in some circles, you're not even supposed to shake hands with Democrats. That's, we're like these villains or something. We've got a hearing coming up next week, and our, Republican colleagues are, going to put forth a hearing about left-wing extremism. And I guess this is a counterpoint supposedly to, the right-wing stuff that's going on. And, we're sitting at the table today sort of trying to prepare, kind of puzzling, well, what are they going to raise? I mean, Seattle had a moment, Portland had a moment, but I mean, nothing that compares to January 6th or, these guys, they were trying to kidnap and assassinate Governor Whitmer in Michigan, or, these AR-15 routine mass killings that we're having like every other day now with the dude who's got, the Facebook page with the Nazi Klan, rant stuff on it. I mean, this is happening day after day after day. And these guys are like killing people. They're going to elementary schools and wiping out kids, or churches and killing, Dylan, what's his name? Dylan Roof killed nine people he just did Bible study with down in Charleston. I mean, they're trying to draw an analogy to that. I mean, that's what we're talking about. So, the disconnect, I get it at some level. I know there are working class whites in particular who don't feel like they're part of, America moving forward. They feel like they've been left behind. Some of them might resent, other groups or, women or whatever moving ahead of them or where they think they should be. And Democrats, we do talk down to people sometimes. There's no question about that. We can be sanctimonious sometimes in our political discourse. But the way this morphs into this violent hate, we really need the Republican Party and, in larger part, white America to, have an intervention with itself on that and figure out who they are and what America is. I hate to stick everybody in the same category because that's not fair, but the folks who are driving the violent extremism right now, they're pretty much white conservatives and mainly evangelical. So they need to get their act together, and the leadership here in the House, of Representatives is not serving them well with the leadership they're providing on these issues.
I heard a lot of things there. Establishing rules of engagement is one way of having these conversations kind of across the aisle, leaning into pre-existing structures that were designed to bring those people together, taking the high touch approach, being considerate of the language that we use so that we aren't disrespecting people, and, understanding especially this great replacement phenomenon, this fear of the great replacement. But I resonate so much with it. I think a lot of us on this call are just have this almost sense of doom of where the political infrastructure is today. I do want to, this has been such a productive and interesting conversation. I want to give access to you all, to our current audience. We have several questions that have already been lined up. And so we're going to go ahead and start with the first one, which comes from Linda Seltzer. She asks, how do you see voting rights issues evolving and affecting elections in 2024? What should we pay the most attention to? And either one can take that question. Either one.
What should be the top issues? Is that kind of the
specifically with voting rights issues? How do you see voting rights issues evolving, and what should we be attending to as it relates to that? And Linda, feel free to send any follow-up comments in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, the sad thing about the voting rights issue is that it's because the Supreme Court has partially gutted the Voting Rights Act, and I think is going to finish the deal in June. There are lots of limitations on what the federal government can do beyond the courts. And so I think a lot of this is going to be state by state. The state AGs are going to have to play a key role in a lot of this. I think private litigation is going to be a big piece of this. We were talking about this today at the CBC meeting. there's a law firm, it's called the Elias Law Firm, and I've known this guy for 30 years now. And basically he does almost all of the Democratic Party litigation and voting rights cases across the country. And he's busier than he should be. We're fighting battles again that, when I worked for Conyers in '87, we were doing the motor voter bill. It's, and got it passed. Well, guess what? They're sort of cutting it down again. And the gerrymandering, and especially in some of the southern states, is horrific. But it's not just southern Wisconsin, and some of those states have it as well. I really think the only way to deal with the essential disenfranchisement that comes from that is to continue to vote en masse. And I think the state elections are going to be pivotal in some of those states too, because if you lose the state legislature and the governor's mansion, you're at the mercy of, it's guess the Republican Party to gerrymander the state, and they draw you out of, as Malcolm X used to say, they don't let you vote, or they fix it so you don't even got nobody to vote for. And that's what's happening in a lot of states right now. So I think it's really it's a grassroots turnout piece. We can keep litigating it, but I don't see the Supreme Court changing in the short run. And passing Voting Rights Act renewal is challenging too, unless we get the House, the Senate, and the White House all back together again.
I'll just add, I agree with everything. This is the time for folks to pay attention to what's happening in their states, the local races, the county races, the state constitutional offices, state AGs who play a critical role, governors, also secretaries of state. And we have one here in Massachusetts who is maybe, I guess, the most senior of all the secretaries of state in the country, who I know is mobilizing and thinking about ways in which to work with other states. And then here in Massachusetts, we can't take anything for granted either or rest on our laurels. There are ways to continue to expand access to the ballot in terms of registration, same-day registration. There are just certain tools that even our state doesn't have, and we're supposed to be progressive. And so how do we actually expand access in every state, including those who are a little bit more progressive than others by certain metrics? And then how do we get folks to vote? And that's just making what we do relevant to their everyday life. And I tell folks who are not politically engaged, you're in trouble, because everything we do affects your daily life, yours now and the generations to come, whether you think so or not.
That is such a good point. Just briefly, we have so many questions to get through. So if each of you could share just 30 seconds, what are some of the ways that people don't think they can be involved in the political process? Like, what are some of the atypical ways that you can become more involved in political participation? Voting is the one, of course, that we always come to. Yes, vote nationally, vote locally. What are some of the other tools in the toolkit?
I'll just name a few. Yes, vote. But there are a whole host of local organizations. So in the municipality where you live, are you engaged with your city council? Are you engaged with your local town meeting? What's the local legislative body? They're passing ordinances and changing policy every day that affects where funding goes, whether or not you have a nice park, a good school in your community, where your grocery stores are going, if they're addressing food deserts. So that local engagement, knowing who your local official is and engaging. When I ran for the city council, I would say, you can call me, you cannot call President Obama. And that first point of contact is critical. And then at the state level, who's in your state house? And maybe you don't know every issue, but what are the issues you care about? And are those people who you either voted for or maybe you didn't engage, are they advocating for the very things you care about for your community and your family? Get engaged. And there is critical ways to do that everywhere we live. And usually there are organizations already set up that you can look up and join. And if frankly, it's not diverse enough or not enough folks are represented, then change that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think people don't realize how easy it is to get involved in politics and be influential, especially with, Princeton credentials and, you've got an area of expertise on something, you identify local state delegate or senator, they're going to love to hear from you because they'll want to, they want it free. Now, don't misunderstand me, but, you can have an impact like that. My wife won her first race knocking on doors. Now, she ran for the House of Delegates. You knock on 3,000 doors, which sounds like a lot, but, if you start 6 months, 9 months out, it really isn't. And you can find yourself in if you're willing to do that, that's hard work, but, it's definitely doable. Helping a candidate run by volunteering, maybe you help door knock some, or, make some phone calls or give them some money. It's amazing. A lot of these candidates in state and local races, if you help them raise $500, you're like a big wheel, because they're doing it like, cookie bake sales to try and raise money. If you give them any kind of chunk of money, or if you can pull together a group of people where everybody chips in $100, it's amazing what, because some of these campaigns run on like $10,000, $20,000. So don't assume that this is like hard to get involved with. And by the way, when I sort of came up, I've sort of watched people sort of fly up the ranks. Many of them did it by working on campaigns. So George Stephanopoulos, for example, had worked on the House side, and he left the House, went to work. He was working in the New York Public Library when he met this guy named Bill Clinton, decided to go work on his campaign in New Hampshire. Clinton does well enough. And, 9 months later, he's like the White House special assistant to the president. And, the rest is history now. I think he makes like $10 million a year doing TV shows or whatever the Sunday morning talk show is. The beauty of politics is you can move up really, really fast. It's not necessarily a wait your turn line of work. If you hook up with the right horse at the right time and you put in some work, it's amazing how much of an impact you can have in a really short span of time.
And there's a lot of emphasis there on local impact. I especially liked the thought on leveraging your expertise and giving access to your expertise to these kind of local spaces, whether that's, participating in local media or participating on like the citizen advisory committees, things of that nature. These are all opportunities. We have a question here from Morgan Smith, class of 21. Amidst the deluge of bad news we confront every day, what keeps you from despairing? What gives you hope for change?
That's a great question. I can start. It's one, my faith. I'm very faith driven. I speak to that all the time. So anyone who knows me, even if they don't know me well, know I speak openly about prayer, being a believer and a Christian and what that means to me. And frankly, I think it's really important for us to model what that looks like in terms of love and bringing people together versus what's coming from the other side. So I do that all the time. But for God's grace, I would not be here on this Zoom, given just a tragic upbringing. And the other piece is my 2 boys, 3 and 5, and my husband and my family, right? So my foundation is my faith and my family all offer inspiration. And when it gets really hard, I just go back to faith and family and just keep pressing forward. And I just know it makes a difference. So that is, I say everyone should have a foundation of some sort, because if you don't, anything you build on top is going to go crumbling, and you have to figure out what that is for yourself.
I mean, for me, there's sort of 2 things. One is I lived through 1968, 69. So, I remember when Dr. King was assassinated, and my mom's crying on the living room couch, and she looks at me and she's, well, at least we still have Bobby Kennedy. And then he was assassinated like a couple months later. And, they were shooting people. Then we had the riots, burned down half of our major cities in the country. And then the FBI started wiping out the Panthers. I mean, we've been through some stuff, right? So, and gee, that's not even going back to Reconstruction and all of that. So there's a lot of resiliency, I think, in our country and especially in our community. And I don't think we're close to the breaking point. We've got a lot of challenges and everything. I do hope that our colleagues, the Republican friends and some of our neighbors from other communities will tone it down, kind of see past the moment and re-engage, I think, at a more sort of human and moral level. Not that we're going to agree with everything with each other, but, we can disagree without being disagreeable, as they say. And right now it's all disagreement, so I think we can work our way through this. In fact, I'm sure we can. I don't know if everybody's got the political will to do that, but it can happen. And I think we're moving it in the right direction.
Resiliency is a good segue into the next question. I think we're only going to have time probably for 2 more questions before we'll share final thoughts, just so everybody on the call is aware. Let's see. So from apologies if I mispronounce this, Patabiraman, what challenges have you faced as Black elected officials, both in running for office and while in office, and how have you approached such challenges?
I will just say, and it speaks to what the Congressman was saying a little bit earlier about just investing in candidates. We don't need another study to show that if you're a Black candidate running for political office, raising money is probably the most challenging part of it. And anything you run for, I don't care what it is, you need resources. And if you go for Congress, Attorney General race was close to $2 million in my race, up against someone who spent over $10 million. And in Massachusetts, you can only invest in a candidate $1,000 per person per year. It's really challenging. And so getting our folks to understand, just like an entrepreneur starting a business or something else, really important to invest in candidates. If you believe in what they would accomplish, if you believe they would represent you well, otherwise we will not change what the political landscape looks like without that investment. Of course, there are other ways, but that's the most challenging part I see and what I hear the most from candidates, particularly those who are unsuccessful. And navigating that, you just got to put it in the work, just like door knocking. You got to pick up the phone and call complete strangers and say, hi, my name is Andrea Campbell. Yes, I'm calling you again. Please call me back and I hope you invest. And I don't live in Massachusetts. I understand that, but I think you should care about this race and let me tell you why. So it is like anything, asking folks to invest in your leadership, but we really have to get the message out why that's really important for folks to not only join office, but to be able to, of course, stay in office. And it's hard for a congressman too, given the resources and the lobbying that takes place at the federal level.
Yeah, and we have to run every 2 years, but I agree. I mean, the raising money is a huge challenge. I mean, I moved to Prince George's County to sort of minimize the racial issue. It's predominantly African-American community by far. And so, I sort of took that off. Frankly, I had people advising me to move to Montgomery County, which is the neighboring suburb in Maryland, because it's at that time, they were more hospitable to the Ivy League credentials, the Princeton, Harvard Law School thing. Frankly, there was resentment in Prince George's in some circles. Fortunately for me, the Obamas kind of blew that up. So that's not a problem anymore. But dialing for dollars, raising money, I raised, in my first congressional run, raised like 1.1 million. It took 13,000 phone calls to do that in a 12-month period. So what that means for you all who can't self-fund, you're not independently wealthy, that means you get up, you go to an office, you start calling people, at 9 a.m. and, you know, you kind of shut it down maybe 2 o'clock or something like that. But you're spending 5-6 hours a day calling people to ask them for money. And it's unpleasant. You know, I found myself calling people, you know, fortunately, there are a lot of people from Princeton and Harvard that had a lot of money. And so they could, and they were used to being donors. But a lot of folks aren't. And, you know, a lot of people do feel, and this may be true for their circumstances, if they give you $50, that's a reach for them. That's a sacrifice for them. And you just have to respect that and appreciate it, because every dollar counts, but you got to go on to the next call. But I definitely, raising money is one of the real barriers to entry for elective office, especially as you move up to statewide offices.
Well, we are at time today. Thank you both so much for your authenticity, for your insight. This has been such a good conversation. If you could, in your final 30 seconds, share closing remarks, thoughts from the evening. Andrea, if we could start with you.
First of all, just thank you everyone for joining tonight and organizing the conversation. Hope to see you in person at Princeton someday. But I think the message is simple. Politics affects every part of your life. It just does. And so if you wanted to affect it in a positive way, including generations to come and the issues we care about, you have to get involved in some way. And for those who are thinking about running for office, if we're going to change the landscape of what this political system looks like to ensure it's responsive to our people's needs, go for it. Oftentimes people shy away from doing it. We need more Princetonians running for office. That expertise, the passion, the public service, being in it for all the right reasons, go for it, and know that I, along with the congressman and others, want to be a resource and a sounding board for those efforts. But thank you all for having me tonight, and thank you for the conversation.
I want to thank you as well for inviting me and giving me a chance to say hi and get a chance to chat with all of you. I share the general's view about involvement in politics. I mean, you know, one thing I would say is that, yes, I've enjoyed being a candidate. I prefer being a candidate, but you know, staffers can do pretty well too. I mean, you know, here in the House, my chief of staff's making around $140, $150, and it caps out at a little over $200,000 a year. So I think a lot of the state offices, state governments have maybe not that good, but pretty good pay scale. So being in public services doesn't necessarily mean a vow of poverty. You know, it's there's ways to have good careers, make a difference in your community, and get compensated pretty well for it. And I got to say that, you know, the sense of reward and accomplishment can be, you know, really gratifying, I think, from a public standpoint. So, and I guess you all have my numbers, or you can reach me easily, but I'll just, you know, 301-537-1451 is my cell number. Feel free to give me a call, reach out if you want to chat. I'm going up to Princeton. This is my 40th reunion coming up, so I'll be there for that. If you're down in DC, or you're coming through, or you live down here, hit me back. Let me know. I'm happy to sit down with folks. Or if you just want to call or email, or text. Text is better than email, because I still have like 12 emails from the campaign. So text that number I just gave you. But I'd love to chat with you and be helpful in any way I can.
You gotta be careful. We might be recruiting you for another how to participate politically and run for office workshop. So
my pleasure. I'd love to do it.
Same here, and thank you all for having us tonight. And yes, happy to continue to engage in conversations, group settings in folks interested in running for office, the nuts and bolts, et cetera. And I also have to thank Anthony as well, who's been, I feel like, a part of every race I've ever done, who also was coordinating some of the logistics to bring this together. So just thank you. And thank you all. And I see a couple of classmates. This is amazing. Thank you all so much.
Eric,
all right, everybody, have a good one.
Over to you.
Yes. Well, first I would like to thank Attorney General Campbell, Representative Ivey, and you, Dr. Sylvain, for joining us. It was an honor and pleasure to share the space with you all this evening. I'd like to thank Anthony Noble and the ABPA Programming Committee, including Karen Ali and Camille Gray, for their hard work in planning this event. And lastly, I would like to thank everyone for attending. Please join us again on May 17th for our Wellness Wednesday event. Am I operating on autopilot? May 20th for the ABPA Public Board meeting. And join us during reunions on May 27th for the post-P-RAIDS ABPA Cookout Family Reunion and Award Ceremony, where we'll be honoring some very special guests, and that will be at 4 p.m. on that Saturday. Thank you again for joining. Have a good evening, everyone. Good night.